I thought I was in my dad's will until the lawyer read the last line and my whole family turned on me. I still remember the day I returned to my family home, carrying just a worn-out duffel bag and a heart weighed down by dread. I had been gone for years, chasing a career in a city far away, thinking I could build a life that was entirely my own. But when I stepped off the train in my old hometown, I felt an unsettling mix of nostalgia and apprehension. It was strange how everything looked unchanged. Familiar houses, the same grocery store on the corner, the little playground where I used to watch kids running around. And yet at that moment, I could sense that something in my life was about to spiral beyond my control. My father was gone. He died suddenly, leaving behind a sorrow so heavy it clung to the walls of our old home like a persistent fog. I arrived a few days after he passed, just in time for the funeral. When I walked through the gate, I noticed how quiet the yard felt. That was the same place Dad used to test me on how to tie fishing knots when I was about 12. I could still remember him standing beneath the big walnut tree out back, his face stern but proud as I fumbled with the line. I was never particularly good at tying anything, but he kept teaching me, telling me I needed patience, which I never had enough of. My older brother, Dimitro, was the first person I saw. He stood on the front porch, arms crossed over his chest, his face locked in an expression that suggested anger, grief, or maybe both. He didn't say hello, just gave me a short nod and muttered that Mom was inside, not taking Dad's death very well. I hadn't expected a warm welcome from him anyway. Though we weren't exactly enemies, we had drifted apart. He stayed in this town, helping Dad with the family business, while I went off to university, then found work in another city and barely kept in touch. Passing him, I entered the living room. It was suffocating. The air, thick with the scent of candles and flowers, made everything more surreal. A few relatives were already there. My aunt and uncle, distant cousins, family friends. My mother sat on the couch with my younger sister, Oksana, by her side. Mom looked up when I came in, and her trembling lips parted in a feeble attempt at a smile. I could tell she had been weeping for days, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale, shoulders slumped from exhaustion. I approached and gently placed a hand on her arm. She immediately broke down, clutching at my shirt and sobbing into my chest. Oksana patted her on the back with trembling fingers, looking up at me with tears in her eyes, as if pleading for me to do something to make it all better. The next day was the funeral. We all stood in a small church listening to the quiet chanting of the priest. Flowers, candles, and hushed conversations blurred together, merging into a painful haze. I kept looking at the casket at the front of the nave, trying to absorb the fact that my father lay there. Although Dad and I had many disagreements, I never imagined losing him would feel like someone ripping a piece of my chest open. I felt shaky, numb. People in black clothes moved around me, some offering condolences, others whispering. In their whispers, I heard the word will. It struck me as odd that people were talking about inheritance at a funeral, yet death often stirs up talk of money, property, and secrets best left buried. My father had a small woodworking and furniture business. Over the decades, he expanded it into something more stable. Maybe not super lucrative, but enough to support the family. Rumor had it he'd drawn up a will that included some peculiar condition. I hadn't heard anything about it. After the service, when the casket was lowered into the ground, I felt myself trembling, unable to look away. Mom's wail tore through the silence, and Oksana wrapped an arm around her, trying to keep her from collapsing. Dimitro stood a few steps away, staring at the grave with unreadable eyes. It was hard to tell what he felt. Grief, bitterness, or perhaps a confusion that mirrored my own. I couldn't get my father's voice out of my head. I kept wishing I could talk to him one last time, ask him for advice, but it was too late for that. We returned to the family home for a short gathering. Relatives kept their conversations low. A hush draped the atmosphere, so thick it was almost suffocating. I slipped outside for fresh air, leaning against the trunk of that old walnut tree. My thoughts raced. Something was definitely off. I could already sense tension among my relatives. My uncle Igor pointedly avoided eye contact with me, whispering things to my aunt. My brother Dimitro barely spoke, wearing a deep scowl. I had no idea what they suspected, but I felt the suspicion swirling around me. Late that afternoon, an attorney arrived to discuss Dad's will. His name was Vadim, a slender, middle-aged man with a briefcase and a somber look in his eyes. He apologized for the timing, but insisted that my father had wanted the reading to happen quickly, right after the funeral. We convened in the living room. Mom sat next to me, occasionally dabbing her cheeks with a tissue. Oksana hovered protectively nearby, while Dimitro stood behind a chair, arms crossed. Uncle Igor and Aunt Elena joined too, as did a couple of distant cousins, though they were obviously less involved in the inheritance. Vadim opened a folder and explained that Dad had left very clear instructions about how to distribute his assets. Part of me felt relief because I assumed Dad had divided everything fairly. I hoped this reading would at least soothe everyone's anxieties. Vadim started going through the standard sections. The house and adjacent property would remain with my mother. A portion of bank savings would be split among me, Dmytro, and Oksana. So far, it sounded balanced, though I noticed Dmytro stealing glances at me, his expression tense. Then came the last portion of the document, and suddenly Vadim's voice dropped. Together with these provisions, my key business holdings and the property registered under number XYZ, the most substantial part of my estate, shall pass fully to my son. I felt my lungs constrict. He was obviously talking about me, since I was Dad's younger son, the one who had left town. Vadim took a breath, his gaze flicking around the room, but only on the condition that he fulfills the requirements stated in the attached addendum. Should he fail to do so, this portion of the inheritance will be divided equally among my brother Igor and all other family members. A wave of confusion washed over me. What requirement? Uncle Igor immediately leaned forward. What's that supposed to mean? He demanded, looking scandalized. Even Dmytro's face darkened in suspicion. This additional clause, Vadim said, opening a sealed envelope, was personally written by your father and is legally binding. According to his instructions, it's to be read aloud now. He unfolded a piece of paper. I leave these key holdings to my son on the condition that he uncovers and accepts the truth about our family's origins. If he refuses to face it or decides to keep it secret from the rest of my relatives, he forfeits the inheritance. Vadim paused, scanning our faces. And that is the final provision your father included. The silence was electric. For a moment, I felt everyone's eyes on me, as if I'd orchestrated this bizarre situation. Dmytro exploded. What does that even mean? The truth about our family's origins? Uncle Igor shook his head in bafflement. Mom started weeping again, perhaps as mystified as any of us. My heart thumped so hard I could almost hear it in my ears. I have no idea, I muttered, my throat painfully tight. I had no clue about any of this, but they didn't look convinced. The suspicion quickly coalesced into an unspoken accusation that I must have known or arranged it. I realized that in this single moment, I had shifted from grieving son to the prime suspect in a twisted family drama. The next day was chaotic. Everyone had an opinion on that cryptic line from Dad's will. Some wanted to contest it in court, claiming Dad wasn't in a proper state of mind to attach such an unusual condition. Others insisted that if I knew the family secret, I should reveal it immediately and let them decide whether I was worthy of receiving my father's holdings. It stung how easily they believed I might be hiding something. Oksana seemed uneasy, torn between supporting me and worrying about the rest of the family. Dmytro confronted me in the kitchen. You always were Dad's favorite, you know, he said, fury pulsing under each word. He gave you money for your university apartment. He bought you a car while I stayed behind and worked for him. Now you get the biggest share, plus some crazy condition that no one else can fulfill. He pinned me with a cold glare. You must have known. I didn't, I snapped back, frustration boiling in my gut. Why would I lie? Do you think I want this? I never asked for any of it. He let out a harsh laugh. Then prove it. Figure out what Dad meant, or else I'm contesting the will along with Uncle Igor. And just like that, he stormed away, leaving me with a roiling pit in my stomach. That night, after everyone had gone to bed or retreated to their rooms, I sat alone in Dad's study. Dust motes spun in the faint glow of the desk lamp, and the familiar smell of old books and wood polish hit me with an ache of nostalgia. When I was little, I would peek in while Dad worked on business ledgers or wrote letters. Sometimes he'd let me sit on a chair in the corner, handing me a pencil to doodle. I never guessed that the same desk might hide secrets I would one day be forced to uncover. I started rummaging through drawers, searching for clues. Old bank statements, receipts for lumber and machinery, handwritten notes about shipments. I found nothing suspicious until I pulled open the bottom drawer and discovered a faded envelope containing letters from decades ago. The dates went back to the 1980s. Inside were references to our family's complicated roots and a few cryptic lines about my grandfather. Something about a different surname, maybe Polish, and references to events in the immediate post-war era. The letter suggested he'd been forced to change his identity to survive some dire circumstances. But it was all vague. I wanted to confront Mom, but from her behavior earlier, I suspected she genuinely knew very little. Dad might have shared bits and pieces over the years, but she was too overwhelmed to piece it all together. So, after a nearly sleepless night, I decided to visit an elderly neighbor who had known my grandparents well. Her name was Katerina. She used to babysit me sometimes, and she had been my grandmother's good friend. If anyone could shed light on the truth of our family origins, it might be her. Walking to her small house felt surreal. The front yard was cluttered with potted plants, and the paint on her porch had peeled away in long strips. I knocked, and an ancient voice called me to come in. She was sitting in her living room, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm day. When she saw me, she smiled faintly and said she had heard about my father. I thanked her for her condolences and hesitated before blurting out why I was there. Something is going on with Dad's will, I explained. He wrote that I have to uncover some hidden truth about our family. I found a few letters hinting Grandpa might not have been who we thought. Her face clouded with sadness as she studied me. Ah, your grandpa. Yes, I've heard rumors all my life, she said finally. People said he came from Poland after the war, that his real name wasn't the one he used. Some believe he took on a new identity to avoid persecution by the Soviets. Others claim he might have done something even worse, like betray someone to save himself. But it was a dark time. Everyone did what they had to do. My heart started hammering. So it was true that Grandpa's identity had been fabricated. But why would Dad make it a condition for me to find out? I mean, so he changed his name. Lots of people had complicated war stories. Isn't that enough? She looked at me tenderly, a sadness in her eyes. Maybe your father felt shame or fear. Perhaps he discovered Grandpa was involved in something far darker than a mere name change. Or maybe he simply decided the time had come to stop burying the past in secrecy. Sometimes, these old ghosts tear families apart if they remain hidden. My mouth felt dry. This must be the truth Dad wanted me to accept, that we were never who. We thought we were, and maybe Grandpa had done something terrible to ensure his new life. Could that alone cause such division? I thanked her and returned home. Igor cornered me as soon as I walked in, demanding answers while Dmytro lingered in the background. Arms folded, scowl in place, I explained the gist of what I'd learned, that Grandpa was probably of Polish origin, that he had changed his identity to escape something, but I had no proof of anything more specific. That's all you have? Uncle Igor said, incredulous. We've known rumors about him being from across the border. So what? That's not a bombshell. Is that the big secret that's worth Dad's entire estate? I shrugged, exasperated. I don't know if there's more. This is new to me, too. My mother, who overheard, shook her head slowly. Her eyes carried sorrow. Your father never went into details. But it weighed on him. He was worried that if certain truths came out, the family would unravel. I think that's why he made you the gatekeeper. Because he trusted you not to turn this into a scandal. He wanted honesty to bring you closer. Dmytro glared at me. If Dad trusted him so much, he could have just told us all directly before he died. Why force us into this humiliating situation? I wish I knew, I answered, feeling helpless. Then I mustered some calm to add, I'm not your enemy, Dmytro. I'm not here to grab everything and run. I just want to figure this out. Fulfill whatever Dad intended, and help the family stay intact. Doesn't that matter to you? His gaze flickered uncertainly. We'll see, he muttered. Over the next few days, I unearthed more fragments. I discovered a hidden compartment in Dad's desk with a small black notebook that appeared to be his personal journal from the last year of his life. Reading it felt intrusive, but I needed to understand him. One entry referenced meeting a woman named Nina, who apparently remembered Grandpa from his youth. Dad wrote that Grandpa had likely been complicit in something dreadful. Maybe turning someone in to the authorities or switching identities with a dead man. Dad admitted he felt tormented, wanted me to know the truth, but was terrified of how I'd react. The final entry, dated just a couple of weeks before his death, read, I can't hide from this any longer. My father's secret has weighed on me too long. I've decided to place the burden on Artyom, that's me, because he's strong enough to search for the truth and still forgive me. I only hope this will bring our family together in the end, instead of tearing it apart. Reading that made tears sting my eyes. I felt as if Dad were whispering to me from beyond the grave, trusting me with the weight of our legacy. If he believed in me, maybe I could help our family. The next morning, I called everyone into the living room. Mom, Dmytro, Oksana, Uncle Igor, Aunt Elena. Some cousins hung around the edges, watching from a distance. Once they were seated, I held up the black notebook. I found Dad's journal, I said, my voice trembling. He wrote about Grandpa having changed his name to hide that he was originally Polish. But more than that, Dad believed Grandpa had betrayed people during the war to save himself. He might have taken on the identity of the real Kovalchuk, a friend or a stranger who died, so he could survive under Soviet rule. Whatever it was, Dad didn't want us living under a lie. The hush that followed was deafening. Mom dabbed her tears and nodded slowly. Your father did mention once that his father had nightmares, kept shouting for forgiveness in his sleep. Oksana sank into her seat, covering her mouth. Uncle Igor let out a sharp breath. That's it then? Your father thinks we should all accept that our heritage is stolen. That Grandpa wasn't really a Kovalchuk? He sounded less angry than before, more stunned. I guess so, I said. Dad wrote that he didn't want to see us fighting over illusions or half-truths. Maybe he included that final line in the will to ensure we faced reality. He set me the task of bringing it to light, even if it's painful. I'm sorry it's come to this. Dmytro stared down at his feet. Then Dad left the biggest portion of the inheritance to you if you manage to find and accept this, right? So what happens to us? I felt a pang of guilt. I never intended to take everything. Yes, legally I fulfill that condition now. But if you think I'm going to hold it over your heads, you're wrong. That's not what Dad wanted. The whole point is that we don't keep secrets anymore. I'll share anything that belongs to me if that's what it takes to keep us together. He glowered for a moment, then something in his expression cracked. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I thought you were just out to cheat me. But if you mean this, he hesitated. I do, I told him firmly. I'll figure out the official paperwork. I can maintain partial ownership only as required by the will. But I can divide the benefits fairly with you and Oksana. I just want to do right by Dad. Uncle Igor let out a long, weary sigh and rubbed his temples. Fine, I suppose if you're being genuine, there's no reason for a legal battle. The business and property are big responsibilities. We should figure out how to run it without turning on each other. We spent the next hour talking in quiet, measured voices, the tension gradually diffusing. Our mother's tears ebbed. And at one point, Oksana came to sit next to me, leaning her head on my shoulder. Even Dmytro accepted a half embrace from me before we ended the discussion. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. I still felt the ache of my father's absence, wishing he had told me everything in person. Then again, maybe he knew that if he shared it himself, family members might refuse to believe him, or they'd direct their anger at him. By putting me in this role, he forced me to uncover the story and unify the others. Over the following months, we navigated a complicated legal process. Vadim, the attorney, confirmed that since I had indeed fulfilled Dad's condition, learning the truth about Grandpa's identity and not hiding it, the estate legally transferred to me. But I chose to distribute shares to Dmytro and Oksana. Uncle Igor no longer threatened to dispute the will. Dmytro, who had been Dad's partner for years in running the business, took on a managerial role and moved some operations forward. Oksana found a niche marketing the family's furniture and craft items on social media, helping us reach new clients. For my part, I used my experience in finance to optimize budgets and negotiate deals, something Dad always struggled with. Mom finally breathed easier. She didn't have to watch her children tear each other apart. A quiet relief settled over her, though she would sometimes get sad again, missing Dad terribly. Occasionally, she would share a little memory of him, like how years ago he had tried to track down old Polish documents but gave up, too scared of what might be revealed. In a sense, I still felt haunted by it all. The knowledge that my grandfather might have betrayed someone long ago, or at the very least stolen a dead man's identity, was unsettling. Yet I couldn't ignore how many families carried similar burdens from the war. People had done unimaginable things to survive. Dad must have felt guilt and shame trickling down the generations, worried we would never be at peace if we didn't face it. On the day we officially finalized the inheritance, Dmytro gave me a tentative nod. You were right, he said, his voice low. Dad wanted us to be stronger together. Sorry for the things I said at first. I offered a small smile. We both got caught up in the heat of it. He hesitated, then added, You know, it still sucks that he didn't just talk to us, but I guess he did what he thought was best. Yeah, I murmured, remembering Dad's scrawled lines about trusting me to handle the fallout. He did. Mom decided to keep living in the old house. I gave it a fresh coat of paint with the help of some cousins who had previously kept a distance because they felt overshadowed by our father. The place was still full of memories, some painful, some comforting. I'd walk around the yard past the big walnut tree, recalling my childhood lessons with Dad. Now, I'd see Oksana's kids playing under that tree, squealing with laughter while my brother and I would share a reluctant smile, acknowledging how the family story moved on despite the tragedies and secrets. Sometimes I wondered if our paternal line was cursed, as Dad said in his journal. But perhaps confronting that curse head-on had broken it. By not letting fear and secrecy dominate, we found a sense of unity. And ironically, it was the bizarre condition in the will that forced us to have those crucial, uncomfortable conversations. Had Dad died without that mention of the truth about our family origins, we might have passively accepted the property distribution or maybe squabbled in minor ways. But we wouldn't have discovered or confronted the deeper story that had burdened him. We might never have learned that Grandpa was likely a man named Witkowski, or how he had navigated the post-war chaos. By forcing the entire family to examine this legacy, Dad made sure we either had to come together or explode into irreconcilable hostility. We chose by some miracle to stand together. Now, months later, I sometimes dream of Dad. In those dreams, he's sitting in the study, going through old documents, telling me to read carefully and not skip the parts that matter. I wake up with my heart pounding, a dull ache in my chest, but I also feel a flicker of gratitude for him, for having faith that despite our flaws, we would rise to the challenge, even if it meant suffering painful revelations. One evening, while alone on the back porch, I pulled out a family photo taken after we'd settled our differences. It was just me, Dmytro, Oksana, and Mom standing under the walnut tree. I noticed how we all looked exhausted but strangely at peace, as though we had survived a storm that left our world rearranged but still standing. I let my fingers brush over Dad's face in a separate, older photograph. We did it, I whispered. Not perfectly, but we did. The wind rattled the leaves overhead, sending shadows dancing across the porch. In that moment, I felt as though Dad was giving me a gentle nod of approval from wherever he was, relieved that his gamble with that final line in the will hadn't destroyed us. None of us could change the complicated truth about our grandfather, nor rewrite the tragedies of the past. But we could stop letting them define us through secrecy and fear. That's what Dad wanted. For us to be honest, to break free from the cycle of suspicion and blame. And though it cost us tears, rage, and nights of restless searching, we emerged stronger. These days, Dimitro and I speak more easily, exchanging updates about the business or about Mom's health. Sometimes we even joke about how unbelievably dramatic those weeks were, how a single sentence in a will nearly set us all at each other's throats. But we also know it brought us closer in ways we never anticipated. My sister Oksana is flourishing, newly engaged, and she's already made me promise to walk her down the aisle if she decides to hold a big ceremony. She says my involvement in uncovering the truth gave her faith that our family can overcome any challenge. My mother, though still recovering from the shock of losing her husband, has started smiling more, telling stories of Dad that make us laugh instead of cry. And me? I decided to keep partial ownership of the family business, enough to ensure it wouldn't splinter under competing claims, but gave large shares to Dimitro and Oksana so we'd all benefit equally. It's not about the money. It's about respecting Dad's final wish that the legacy he worked for wouldn't tear us apart. I feel at peace with the decision. I like to think that's precisely what Dad hoped for. Sometimes I stroll by the river where Dad once took me fishing. The water flows with the same languid grace as always, and it's comforting to think of how life continues despite the storms we face. I lean over the bank, remembering how Dad taught me to tie a hook. "Hold on tight," he would say, "and make sure your knots are good, or else you'll lose your catch." In a way, maybe that's the lesson he imparted in his will. In the end, the knots that bind families should be strong enough to hold, even when secrets and suspicion threaten to pull us apart. If there's one thing I've truly learned, it's that honesty is the only real way to protect those ties. Whenever I recall that first day stepping into our house and seeing everyone look at me with resentment and confusion, I can't help but feel a twinge of relief that we made it through. We tore open that hidden history and confronted it. I used to think the most important part of a will was the property or money. Now I see it was never about that. The real inheritance was the truth Dad wanted to pass on, forcing us either to reject it and remain in denial or to accept it and move on as a stronger family. I remember him telling me once, "It's better to face a painful truth than live comfortably in a lie." At the time, I didn't grasp the weight of his words. But now, I carry them inside me, knowing I've upheld my father's final request to uncover our complicated origin story and help our family find unity in the aftermath. It may not be a fairy tale, but it's real and it's ours. And I feel strangely proud. I used to think I'd just show up at the funeral, say goodbye, and move on. Instead, Dad's departure became the start of a personal quest to unravel a puzzle he'd left behind, sealed in a final line of his will. It tested my relationships, threatened to tear me from my siblings, and forced me to question whether I was ready to claim a legacy that wasn't at all what it seemed. Yet in the end, the very thing that could have broken us was what bound us more tightly together. We told each other the truth, forgave the old sins of the past, and discovered that the bonds of family are deeper than any shared surname or inheritance. That's the truth Dad wanted me to accept, and I have. Wherever he is, I hope he can finally rest in peace, free of the guilt and fear that shadowed him in life. As for me, I look at our old house, our business, and our new unity, and realize that some legacies aren't about wealth. They're about healing, about forging a future unburdened by secrets. When I close my eyes, I can almost hear Dad's voice once more. "Be patient, son, and make your knots strong." This time, I think I finally understand.